Interconnectivity versus lateralization of the left and right hemispheres. Researched and presented by Leander, Lori, Megan, and Sam for EDPS 693.27. Our presentation will begin with an introduction to give context to the debate between lateralization and interconnectivity. We will then go into more detail on what lateralization is, what interconnectivity is, and what is the role of the corpus callosum. We will wrap up the presentation by providing relevant research and classroom applications. At the end of the presentation, you are invited to complete a follow-up activity and test your understanding of this newfound knowledge with a Kahoot. Many of us have heard about and are maybe guilty of subscribing to popular neuromyths. For example, the idea that students are either right-brained and excel in creative tasks or left-brained and excel in analytical tasks is a common belief amongst educators and the general population. This idea stems from the fact that the human brain is divided into two hemispheres which each have specific functions. Up until the late 20th century, there were two main schools of thought when it came to brain behavior. The localizationists believed that each separate area of the brain was responsible for certain tasks. The anti-localizationists, on the other hand, believe that the brain functions as a unified organ and that cognitive tasks require all parts of the brain. The localizationist theory eventually evolved into the idea that the left hemisphere was responsible for language and the right hemisphere was responsible for visual spatial skills. This became the foundation of many common neuromyths, such as cerebral dominance, where the left hemisphere was considered the dominant hemisphere and the right hemisphere played a more minor role. Other neuromyths include the idea that left-handedness results in learning disorders, and like I mentioned before, that there is such thing as a right-brained learner and a left-brained learner. The anti-localizationist theory that the main brain functions as a whole led to the belief that only a small portion of the brain is being utilized, thus promoting the common misconception that we only use 10% of our brains. These are, however, just neuromyths, and they provide an oversimplified understanding of the neuroscience. The truth of whether the brain hemispheres work independently or together lies somewhere in between. In this presentation, we aim to explain the difference between hemispheric lateralization and interconnectivity and the applications in the classroom. Before we begin, let's complete this activity to demonstrate how the two hemispheres of the brain are involved during a typical reading comprehension assessment. I invite you to read the passage on your own and answer the 7 follow-up questions. You may have found questions 1 through 4 fairly straightforward. That's because they are explicit comprehension questions. If you understood the passage, you likely answered these questions correctly. Questions 5 through 7, however, do not have a clear answer. Question 5, for example, is quite ambiguous. It is not clear if it is asking the collective total cost, or the total cost for each child, or the cost per candy. Similarly, question 6 requires the context of the passage and possibly background knowledge or experience in order to make an inference. Lastly, question 7 is open-ended and has endless possible answers. Since the first 4 questions are factual and objective, you relied on the left hemisphere of your brain to answer these questions. However, as question 5 through 7 increased in complexity, you activated the right hemisphere of your brain to assist in determining an answer. In the next few slides, we will see the responsibilities of each hemisphere of the brain and how the two hemispheres are interconnected and mutually dependent.
The definition of lateralization is the dominance of one hemisphere over another in function. Something that would be an example of function is what I'm doing right now, speaking. One thing that is important to note is lateralization is not unique to the human brain. It is being found in birds, monkeys, and surprisingly even spiders. I would like to talk about a few theories about why lateralization happens. Studies have found that the more an animal brain is lateralized, the more it will prefer one side over another. An example of this is what would be called handedness. Humans can be right-handed or left-handed. Researchers have studied um, monkeys, for example, to determine if they are given advantage by using a right paw to, for example, gather food more quickly. The controversy around this is that it's not always the case, it's just the way animals live. Another theory surrounding lateralization is just the fact that the neurons, for example, in the left hemisphere are closer together. So those neurons would connect together just due to proximity. And similarly, the same thing would be happening on the right side. When things are closer together, they would join together. The last theory of lateralization that I would like to talk about is lateralization allows animals to do two things at the same time. For example, if you have an animal that has a predator, it would need for survival to have a reaction to get away from that predator. At the same time, that animal would need to eat in order to survive. If the animal can do those two things together, it has an advantage over survival due to lateralization. These are just theories, but it's interesting. This slide demonstrates some of the functions found typically in the left and right hemisphere. I am going to say typically because it's not an always. For example, language can be found for the most part in the left hemisphere with most humans, but there's always a case where this can be found on the right side of the hemisphere of the brain. This slide shows what typically happens in lateralization on the left hemisphere of the brain in regards to language. In 1865, Pierre-Paul Broca presented his findings in Paris of an area that's now named after him called the Broca's area, which you can see on the slide, and it was found in the frontal gyrus. The way he found it was there was a patient of his whose speech was really garbled, and after he died, he did a autopsy of his brain and he found a lesion in this area. Later, Karl Wernicke published his findings in Germany in 1876, and he discovered Wernicke's area in the left temporal lobe. What is known about this area is it is an area where speech is comprehended. The articulus faticulus is a band of nerves that connect the Wernicke's and Broca areas, and through that connection, we are helped to form words, speak clearly, and understand concepts in language form. This is the right hemisphere, and there's a few areas of lateralization that I'm going to talk about. One of them is found in the right temporal lobe, and it involves an area that's activated when there's facial recognition and scene perception. What they did is they showed the people participating in the research pictures of faces and scenes, and this area was activated. They also are studying art therapy, where the right parietal lobe is activated along with the frontal cortex. And what they're trying to determine is this connection helpful to healing of trauma? Also, in this slide is an area that you can see that is lit up. This is the right temporoparietal junction, and what they have discovered about this is it's employed to discern and understand the actions of other human beings. In the research, they had people watching other people do weights, and what they're trying to figure out is, do we learn by watching the actions of others? And this is being heavily researched. It's pretty interesting. In lateralization, there's no case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde where the brain hemispheres are arguing with each other. In the words of Taylor Swift, there's certainly no bad blood between them. They need each other, and just some functions are more localized than others.
Interconnectivity, or hemispheric connectivity, is the idea that both hemispheres work together. Neuroimaging shows that nearly all cognitive tasks activate both hemispheres of the brain. However, this does not mean that the two hemispheres are mirror images of each other or that they contribute to tasks equally. Hemispheric asymmetries exist, meaning that the right and left hemispheres are not the same. As we have just learned, each hemisphere has its strengths and areas of expertise. However, with interconnectivity, the two hemispheres are in constant communication. The hemispheric division of labor, or the who does what, is determined by the neurological processes that is required and therefore is different depending on the task. So even though each hemisphere has its own specialization, the two hemispheres are in constant communication while performing most tasks. As the saying goes, teamwork makes the dream work. So why not combine areas of expertise and specialization to make the ultimate dream team? There are many benefits of interconnectivity. One is that it allows for improved task performance. For example, when the two hemispheres work together to combine their areas of expertise, tasks are completed more successfully. The two hemispheres complement one another and are able to complete tasks that would not be possible without the help of the other hemisphere. Also, interconnectivity allows for increased task complexity. Simple tasks may only require one hemisphere, but complex tasks require both sides to work together to accomplish the task. As you will remember, questions 4 through 7 of the Jack and Jill's Big Adventure activity were more complex than the rote comprehension questions and needed active participation from both the left and right hemisphere to not only make sense of the question, but to also come up with a reasonable answer. Another example of increased task complexity is the example here with the A's. Being able to match the two capital A's requires perceptual analysis to match the physical shape of the two letters and can be performed exclusively by the right hemisphere. However, being able to match a capital A with a lowercase a requires an extra step to recognize that the capital letter is an A and the lowercase letter is an A, and they are, therefore, the same letter. Some examples of hemispheric interconnectivity include communication and speech perception. While the left hemisphere is mainly responsible for forming and interpreting spoken language, to truly understand the meaning of what is being said, interconnectivity is essential. The left hemisphere will interpret the words or the what is being said. However, the right hemisphere interprets the emotional connotation or the how it is being said. This includes the context of the conversation as well as the tone of voice. The interconnectivity of these hemispheres is particularly important for understanding figures of speech, such as metaphors or sarcasm. Another example of interconnectivity is creative thinking. The right hemisphere is typically known for being the more creative side of the brain. However, using both sides of the brain allows you to integrate strengths and processes from both sides, which leads to generating new ideas, which lead to that aha moment when working on divergent tasks that require creative problem solving.
Wondering how information travels between your two amazing cerebral hemispheres? In part, you can thank your colossal corpus callosum. It is a thick band of approximately 200 million axons that create a white matter tract to connect your left and right hemispheres homologously. In other words, unlike other circuits that connect different brain regions, the corpus callosum will connect similar regions, the left temporal lobe to the right temporal lobe, the left parietal lobe to the right parietal lobe, etc. This thick white matter tract transfers sensory, motor, and cognitive information and maintains the balance of arousal and attention. The corpus callosum makes it possible to integrate visual spatial information, to have sensory perception, motor control, language processing, problem-solving skills, and maintain balance. As a fetus, our neurons are differentiating and migrating, which means they are extending and moving towards their area of specific function. This also happens with the axons that form our corpus callosum. We already have some remodeling happening too, with axons being thinned. This is happening when fetuses are only 12 to 22 weeks gestation age and is affected by our genes and Q maps. During this time, the corpus callosum is also forming its 4 parts: the truncus, rostrum, genu, and splenium. Each part of the corpus callosum connects specific lobes and cortexes. For example, the rostrum is the area that connects the frontal lobes. Interestingly, the motor cortex is joined by thicker axons, and proportionately more of the corpus callosum is devoted to the supplementary motor areas, which includes Broca's motor functions for speech. At birth, the number of callosal neurons is fixed, meaning it is not going to change in number. However, it will change structurally even after birth. Our white matter tracts, including the corpus callosum, continue to increase in volume and mature. Unnecessary connections continue to be pruned, and useful ones are reinforced. Children can change and adapt their thoughts and behaviors through interconnecting the hemispheres by the corpus callosum. This actually continues as we age, increasing the organization of our cerebral areas even into our 5th decade. Some studies are showing gender differences within our corpus callosum. Boys seem to have more connections within their hemispheres. Girls seem to have more connections between their hemispheres, creating a bigger corpus callosum. There also seems to be differences in growth. Boys seem to have a growth spurt in the corpus callosum region that interconnects the parietal and temporal lobes 1 to 2 years later than the same growth spurt in girls. This may be connected to the developmental differences in language functions. We have already heard how important the interconnectivity of our hemispheres is. Let's take another example looking at our binocular vision. Hold up 2 markers or objects directly in front of your nose, the first being about 20 centimeters away and the second about 40 centimeters away. Look at the first marker. Keep looking at it and tell me how many markers you see behind it. Now look at the second marker. Keep looking at it and tell me how many markers you see in front of it. Did you see 2 images of the marker that you weren't focusing on? That's normal. To have binocular vision, both images received from our 2 eyes must come together to form one image. This requires the information to travel across our corpus callosum to reach the other side of the occipital lobe for processing and interpretation. Without our corpus callosum, we would be seeing double vision all the time. It makes sense then that if our corpus callosum is damaged, the communication between our left and right hemispheres will be affected. Some of the disorders caused by a damaged corpus callosum include pseudobulbar palsy, speech ataxia, movement ataxia, alien hand syndrome, and agenesis is caused by a number of factors such as chromosomal error, genetic factors, prenatal infections, and other prenatal environmental factors. It is a rare disorder affecting 1 in 4,000 people and can be as severe as being born without a corpus callosum. Demyelination, or thinning of the corpus callosum, is associated with neurodegenerative diseases, and a colostomy may be performed to alleviate epileptic seizures when medications fail. Early colostomies in the 1960s provided much insight into the function of the corpus callosum. Academically, challenges with the corpus callosum can appear as a wide range of learning disabilities. The structural issues may be comorbid with other challenges as well. If you only have abnormalities with your corpus callosum, you may have the symptoms of intellectual disabilities, problems with problem solving and abstract thinking, poor motor coordination, poor muscle tone, ADHD, and immature social skills. Let's consider reading. While reading, we need to transfer visual and emotional information from the right side of the brain to the left, and transfer the meaning of the text from the left side of the brain to the right. Without the corpus callosum, we may be able to decode, for example, but not comprehend. With dyslexia, some regions of the corpus callosum are reduced, like the midbody, and others are enlarged, like the splenium. More research needs to be done. In general, when there is a decrease in interconnectivity through the corpus callosum, there is usually an increase in lateralization.
The study of lateralization and interconnectivity dates back hundreds of years and has gone through significant theoretical changes in that time. A notable beginning to these ideas is that of phrenology. This term was coined by Franz Joseph Gall in the early 1800s and describes that it is the shape of the outer skull that depicts personality traits and intellectual ability. This idea has since been disproved, which made way for scientists like Broca and Wernicke to dive into the true nature of the brain, as described earlier. These conclusions then led us to the modern theories on lateralization and interconnectedness. It is important for educators to understand where neuroscience has come from in order to best support the various students in their classrooms. Unsupported theories such as left versus right-brained may pigeonhole our students into categories that may limit their potential. If a teacher only sees a student as creative, or only as mathematical, or left or right-brained, then that student may hold those beliefs as well and fail to thrive at the opposite end of the spectrum. More useful information for use in the classroom are studies looking at lateralization and ADHD. These studies found that children with ADHD present with a phenomenon known as crossed laterality, which means that various aspects like hand, foot, or eye dominance is different. For example, a child may be right hand dominant but left eye dominant. This crossing can create difficulties in reading and writing, as well as issues with concentration because their brain is creating confusion in the corpus callosum. Therefore, in the educational context, lateral dominance assessments should be included in order to help diagnose and treat ADHD. Another example is MRI results comparing children with traumatic brain injuries, such as concussions, with typical development. These studies showed increased activation in the right language centers in children with traumatic brain injuries, suggesting the brain is compensating for damage to the left side language centers. This is a clear indication of interconnectedness. Using this knowledge, we can help students improve in the classroom as well as in the gymnasium by improving their body awareness and spatial awareness. Understanding how the brain functions with neurological damage or dysfunction helps create empathy and provide evidence-based support and solutions for those students. So where do we go from here? Beaton and Richards are currently researching a variety of topics surrounding lateralization and interconnectedness, such as the relationship between left and right-handedness and language lateralization, the genetic basis of asymmetry and neurodevelopmental conditions, as well as the adaptive significance of laterality for humans and non-humans. There's a significant separation between humans and non-humans in brain laterality. As well, new technologies for brain scans and understanding what is going on in children's brains are starting to come about. Fiber optic probes are using light to scan brains and are able to see all of the brain connections far more clear. If we as educators can continue to embrace developing technologies and understandings of the brain, we can continue to support students not only in their learning, but also in their performance of everyday tasks. Now that we've learned that our brains integrate interconnectivity and lateralization through the corpus callosum, we should be eager to be open to new research and ideas and possibilities in this area. This increased knowledge helps us develop as educators and will positively impact our students. If we don't limit our expectations of our hemispheric functioning, then we won't limit the expectations of our students, and we will see them achieve their highest potential. You can go to the next slide and try out our Kahoot to test your knowledge of this area, as well as the slide following that has some extra materials.